So in this video, I want to talk a little bit. It's going to kind of be a bit more, not rambling, but just kind of talking things out. Something that I've kind of been thinking about for a while now, for quite a while now, is trying to find kind of the roots of problems or issues that our world is facing, whether it's the church facing it or politically, um, the problems that men and women are having kind of currently associating with each other. Um, Lots of problems that we see in the world, and not just in America, not just in the West, but in just the world in general, and kind of the roots of those problems and where they kind of come from. And there's a lot of different ideas and theories that you can find, a lot of people kind of pointing to different places or different events or different moments in history where they kind of point to these things. Some people blame, oh, it's modern, third wave feminism, second wave, first wave feminism. They'll try to blame it on those things, or they'll say, oh, it's all the commie bastards. It's their fault. It's this, that, or the other. It's the what's the League of Nations and now the UN and this kind of global new world order or the Illuminati or whatever they kind of want to blame, or whatever point in history they want to point to. And so I've just kind of been thinking, like, where is there a kind of moment in time or a segment of time or an era of history that kind of I think might be kind of the root cause of it, because I think that all of those are symptoms of something that kind of started a little further back than that, and not even with nefarious ends. I think I'm going to make a bit of a case for that it's not some conspiratorial, there's this cabal of people out there that are planning a bunch of things. I think it just ends up being that certain interests occasionally align in certain way to where different groups of people are working things in certain ways that end up in certain outcomes. And so the kind of point in history that I think really everything started to turn on its head, so to speak, was the Victorian era. And I think the Victorian era is a fascinating era. It's one of the eras of history that I think is among the most interesting. It's where things like steampunk kind of come from, which I think is a really cool genre of fiction. It's also where you get things like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You get Bram Stoker's Dracula. All kind of come from that Victorian era. It's the Wild West era for America. It's the samurai era for not kind of the ending of the samurai era. So it's where you start to get the interaction between the Japanese and the Americans, where things like the Last Samurai story take place during that time. So you, it's, it's the era of history where, uh, what was the expression? There was a moment in time where a samurai in Japan could have sent Abraham Lincoln a fax. That is the Victorian era. That it's the birth of fast communications via the what is it with the always forget the telegraph, the telegraph wires all across country, the invention of telephones, the invention of recording devices. But it started prior to that, uh, at the end of the Napoleonic era. So we're talking the early 1800s, the 19th century, and the shift into that kind of industrial revolution was also taking place during this time period. So it's kind of that Victorian era industrial revolution. And I think most of the issues we face today have spawned from that. And again, I don't think it was intentional. Like someone in Victorian England was sitting there thinking, I want to destroy the world 200 years from now, or I want to start a snowball down a hill that will get bigger and bigger and cause an avalanche, or anything along those lines. I think it was just people thinking about their interests and how to do things maybe more efficiently or effectively, or wanting to answer questions that they had, and new ways of kind of doing that. But from that, we started to see certain things occur that have now occurred more often and in rapid succession, faster and faster as kind of time has gone on. As we've gotten further away, the events that have kind of birthed from that have been causing problems are becoming more and more frequent. The One of the big ones was that with the birth of the Industrial Revolution, with things like steam engines, trains being built, steamships, ironclads, whatever these massive productions that needed to be done, they needed factory workers. And the ways they got factory workers was in several ways. A big part of it was two things. One, the destruction of guilds, the destruction of specialized labor, that they didn't care about having skilled craftsmen who built tables or who put together engines for the big steam things. It became about speed and quantity. And so they started developing things like conveyor belts and all these things. And this, again, it's over the course of over a century. So this isn't something that happened overnight. It was gradual. What's the expression? Gradual and then sudden kind of thing. And the destruction of the guilds was a big part of this birthing of the Industrial Revolution. And this had impacts that are stretched out to today. And I talked about it, for example, in my video about eldership of the overseers of churches. How the way that the church is supposed to proliferate is that you have an overseer, and he trains other men to be overseers who can plant new churches or fill in positions that need to be filled, like teaching other children in the church. The young in the church can be filled by the people he's training as well. Replace him when he retires or passes away. Those kinds of things. It's that idea of apprenticeship that the guilds had, where if you wanted to build tables in this city, or if you wanted to make glass, or you wanted whatever skill you wanted to learn, you had to learn it from the guilds. And if you were a man, for example, and your father was in the carpentry guild, you would most likely go into the carpentry guild. But if you didn't want to be a carpenter, maybe you wanted to get into masonry, he would actually know the masons in the mason guild, and he would get you in touch with them. And there was this interconnectivity between the guilds, and this created a sense of community. Whereas with factory workers, it was come in, do your job, and leave. You're replaceable, you're a cog, you're just another part of the machine. And because it was all about the machine just churns out more and more of the product. And we'll get into that. We have become the product to churn out more products, to make more products. And that's ultimately where that leads. The other aspect of it, though, wasn't this just the destruction of the guilds, it was the destruction of the clans, of tribes, of families, of the family. And this isn't the nuclear family like we might think about. A lot of people today in like the tradcon movements or other conservative movements, they lament the destruction of the nuclear family, of the husband, the wife, and the children, with a 4-bedroom house and the white picket fence, and they lament its destruction. But that was actually a relatively new thing that kind of was birthed out of the destruction of the actual family. The nuclear family, this kind of small unit on their own in the suburbs, is a relatively new phenomenon, and it's gone. It only lasted for about 100 years, and it was birthed out of the Victorian era. During the Victorian era and most of it, but it kind of fell away towards the end because it was being destroyed in that era in many ways because of this need for factory workers, because of this need for people to just fill positions, whether it was positions in militaries or positions in politics, positions in factories, positions in all these different things. They were destroying the clans, and they also had to destroy the family to do this, because the family previously was the clan. It was the tribe. I think I said clan a moment ago. I meant guilds. They destroyed the guilds and the clans, essentially. That families were unified. It wasn't a nuclear family in a husband, wife, children. It was a whole family. It was parents, their children, their children's children, all of them together. One of the problems we face now that people talk about is, well, I can't afford a house. You have these people in their 30s and 40s who aren't even married, don't have any kids, and part of the reason why is because I can't afford it. I can't afford a family. I can't afford a house. I can't afford kids. I can't afford to do any of that. And even if I get married, you have to have two incomes, and you have to have your wife can't stay home and raise your kids, so now you've got to pay for daycare, and then you've got to send them to public school and all the problems that come with that. And so you have these legitimate reasons. I'm not going to belittle any of that, but it all comes from this idea of you have to be on your own. The tribe, the clan, the family is dissolved. You don't take care of your parents anymore. Your parents don't take care of you once you reach a certain age anymore. Because I want you to consider that Could you afford, so hypothetically, let's say that there's a man and he has a wife and they're expecting their first child, and they lamenting the fact that she has to go out and work. Maybe she doesn't want to work. She's one of those women who wants to be a housewife. She wants to be a mother. She wants to stay home with the children, but they can't afford it. If you lived with your parents, could you afford it? Could their income, along with your income, make it so that your wife could stay home and raise your children? But why aren't you doing that? Because it's shameful? Why is it shameful? For all of human history, the Bible talks about this. Jesus Christ tells us that he is going to his Father's house to prepare a place for us. Because for all of human history, that's what men did. They would add on to their parents' house. They would add a wing, you would add on another area to your parents' house, and you would take your wife would come and she would live with you. If you had a sister and she married someone else, she would go live with his family. And some families would combine. If they lived in a small area, they might just combine their resources. And my land is here, your land is here. Let's build a house here for our kids. And they lived together. They took care of each other. The grandparents helped raise the children, and the children helped take care of the grandparents when they were older. The idea of shuffling your parents off to a home, which is just another expense that you have, was foreign to them. And it's one thing if there's a medical issue, and so you have to have specialized care. So you send your loved ones to a special facility because of that. That'd be one thing. But you have perfectly healthy grandparents who are just alone. And now we live in an era, again, this is 200 years removed from where this process got started. And so you have these people lamenting the 50s, but the 50s were the way they were because they were changing what was already done before. The idea that you would go off on your own and you would have to live with just you, your wife, and your children, and you have to pay for everything yourself, take care of everything yourself. That was a foreign concept. It would have been a foreign concept to people, but it came about because of the building of cities, the building of factories, the establishment of these kinds of jobs where you were a hourly worker, you were salaried, you were doing these things, you were working in the coal mines and all that stuff, and so you had to live in the mining town because you they paid you in company store credit, so you had to live close to the company store, those types of things, and it became a form of indentured servitude and all of these other things. And you can see the progression if you look back on it, from the destruction of the clans and the families. And it goes back before necessarily the Victorian era. I'm not pinning everything there because some seeds of this go back even further. I talked about in a previous video about the Catholic Church outlawing priest marriage. They did this back in the 12th century, the 1200s. They did in the 1200s, which would be the 13th century. They outlawed priest marriage, which is one of an interesting things because that means for 1200 years Catholic priests were allowed to marry, but only for the last 800 years have they not been allowed to marry. So the priests not being able to marry is actually the newer, younger thing. It hasn't even lasted as long. And we've seen in the last 800 years, the Catholic Church has gotten kind of, in many ways, weaker and weaker because of it. I don't want to harp on that too much, but that's kind of finding the roots of things, right? The the moments of these touch moments where power was being centralized by some group, and we're now feeling ripples of it decades and centuries later. So the destruction of the clans, the destruction of the guilds, which was necessary for the rise of industrialization. At least they believed it was necessary. They believed that it would facilitate it better. And this had a ripple effect. So for example, the feminist movement was birthed in no small part to create more factory workers. There's a quote by G.K. Chesterton. I'm going to paraphrase it. Hopefully, I don't butcher it too much. But essentially, it goes like this: that women, the great lie of feminism, is that it convinced women that they were slaves working for their family that loved them, but they were free working for a boss who doesn't care about them. uh, to the factory, to whatever job you have right now, man or woman, you are fundamentally replaceable. To your family, again, man or woman, you are irreplaceable. Even if you passed away and a few years later your spouse remarries, they're not replacing you. You will always be a part of them that is missing and that they can't just replace. But to your job, you're just another cog. Now, not every company is the same, not every work environment is the same. You might have a situation where you're friends with your coworkers, and so to your coworkers, you might hold great value, and if you were to pass away, or you were to leave your job, or you were to have be fired by someone higher up the chain, it could impact them in certain ways. But that's not because you're not working there anymore. It's because you became a fixture in their life, in the same way that you could become a fixture in anyone's life. It's not, oh, my coworker's gone. It's, oh, my friend is gone. But to the business, to the company, to the ultimate kind of bottom line of how it operates, you mean nothing. You are entirely replaceable. Now, this again doesn't mean that you shouldn't work or that work doesn't have any value. Obviously, it does. It's an important factor of life. It's developing the necessary resources so that you can provide for your family and you can take care of each other and all of those things. These are important things, but they are not the most important things. Your job is only as important as what it allows you to do with your family, with your friends, with things that actually matter in eternity and in the long run and for your soul. That is where the importance of those things lies. But during the Victorian era, you had these capitalists, and I'm not going to harp on capitalists. I prefer capitalism over communism, but they saw a need. We need to produce a certain amount of guns for this war that we're in, or we need to produce a certain amount of food to feed all of these people, or we need to produce a certain amount of whatever resource. And they calculated how to do that the most efficient way possible. And doing that required them to propagandize people and to kind of change the way that people thought about things and did things. And this again was something that began and lasted and was done over the course of a century or more. Again, we're 200 years past this, and there's still kind of work. They're still doing it to this day. It's not even something that's stopped or has uh, been finished. It's not a finished work. It's a continual work. And so you have that with feminism. You have that with communism, right? Communism came about in some ways as a response to this, but in a very backwards kind of way, uh, because they saw the kind of capitalists who were treating people like cogs in a machine, and they said, well, the cogs in the machine are the machine. The machine doesn't work without the cogs. So what do we need the higher ups for? And it became about everyone should own everything, and it has its own set of problems that won't get into too much, but you can see the progression as it builds. So somebody who might say like, "Oh, all of this is the fault of those damn commies." Well, the communists were responding to these other problems that were brought up earlier. The feminists were the kind of natural progression of this. It's interesting because feminism and communism kind of partnered up, but feminism actually has its roots in capitalism and the production of more factory workers, the further destruction of the family, carting off children to schools, which schools and prisons were identically created. Um, the idea of gender mixing schools and uh, the idea of just having someone else educate your children anyway. The idea of a organized kind of police force that is top down from the state. All of these things kind of started out of the Industrial Revolution and the Victorian era. And again, that's not to say that some of these things don't have roots going back even further. So another issue that came about of this era is evolution and evolutionary ideology, and kind of the idea of God is dead. We don't need God anymore. There are natural explanations for everything, and we just need to find them, kind of thing. And God is for having God as your reason for things is a crutch, and you don't need that. That kind of started a little bit before this, but really got cemented through people like Charles Darwin, who came about during this time period, right? So all of this came out of this same kind of era. A little bit before that, a little bit after that. It's interesting that the founding of America predates this just enough that the Constitution has some interesting things that are predate this to a way that if we actually held to them could have actually helped protect us from this, but because that was during the kind of Napoleonic era before that, and then you go back even further to other eras of history where you saw more, some of these ideas, while they might have had a little bit of a seed in some of those eras, they really kind of started to blossom in the Victorian era and the Industrial Revolution, the American Civil War, which wasn't technically a civil war; it was a revolutionary war. It was a failed revolution, not a failed civil war. But that's a whole other that'd be a whole other video for a whole other time. But the 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 fundamental principles of most of the problems that we see today, I think, have their roots back during that era. Because, for example, I brought up the gender mixing of schools, the no longer gender segregating schools. So the way children used to be educated was they were educated at home. Uh, it's a funny thing that we live in an era where most people cannot read. I saw there's a statistic that came out recently that said something like 60% of adults, so 60% of adults in America cannot read above a third grade level. People today are just objectively dumber than at almost any other point in history, and it's not just an American problem. American education is actually, depending when you account for certain factors, is still one of the best in the world, and we've produced 60% of a population that can't read. Now that does mean that 40% of the population can, which, looking back uh, in other cultures and history and things like that, seems like a really high percentage, when there were times in history where you would have a nation where 2% of the population was literate and could read. But going back to the Victorian era, for example, the most widely read books were the complete works of Shakespeare and the King James Bible. And so it's a humorous thing to think about that a random homesteader in Wyoming in the 1850s was more literate than people today who have access to the internet. You have access to more information, but that doesn't make you more intelligent. Humans have always been relatively the same intelligence. It's just the access to information that we have, the amount of time you can spend accessing that information. If you have to spend all day farming just so that you can eat that day, that impacts your ability to read or to study other things. That does not mean you are incapable of understanding. It's the idea that if you could travel back in time, and if you could understand each other, so you could speak a language they could understand, and they could speak a language you could understand, that you could go back in time to almost any point in history, to any human, almost anywhere in the world. And again, as long as you were able to speak the same language, and you could fundamentally explain most things that you know to them that you think are so modern and erudite and enlightenment and all of these things. The only difference would be that that person just never took the time to care about it because they were caring about other things, or they just didn't have access to the information you did, so it just never occurred to them. So, for example, if you were to, let's say, go back in time and you were to ask someone, is the world round? There's always this kind of meme thing that people used to believe the earth was flat. Everyone believed it. And it wasn't until, Christopher Columbus, that he was the first guy to ever really think the world was round. That is the level of our education now, that we actually think that that's the way things used to be, that it was Columbus who was the first one to even think of the world being round. But that's actually not the case. If you could go back in time and you were to go back to, like, England in the 12th century, and you were to just walk up to some random person, so 200 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and you were to ask that person in England in the 12th century, is the earth round or is it flat? It was probably a question they would have never thought of because it didn't matter to them at all. They didn't have a belief one way or the other. You would have been the first person to spark that question in their mind, likely. And they probably would have looked around and been like, I don't know, it looks kind of flat, but I don't know, there's the horizon. And especially if you started to have a conversation with them about it, they would come probably very quickly to, yeah, this is probably round. So what? I'm going to go back to farming now so that my family doesn't starve to death. So it's the idea that they weren't any stupider than you. But people today believe that they are giants standing on the shoulders of idiots, when it's the exact opposite. You are idiots standing on the shoulders of giants. But you don't realize that. So the way that people used to be educated was by their families, and most people could read to some level for a huge part of most of history, that at least as much as they needed to. And most people who didn't need to read, who didn't know how to read, was because they didn't need to. There was no there was no skill, there was no benefit to that for them. They were worried about feeding their family, about getting through the next winter. Now, we live in a very privileged time where we can worry about things like reading. But so people used to be educated at home, but that was difficult, and there would always be skills that you didn't have. This is the way homeschooling works today, that communities would come together to teach certain skills. So you would be a parent, your child would need to learn mathematics or something about science, and you wouldn't know it. So you would hire someone, or another person from one of the other families in your community would teach that class. And children, young children, so up to the ages of about 10, 11, 12, would all be taught together, boys and girls. And then after that, once you reached the 12 or 13, somewhere around there, the boys would usually go off and start apprenticing, or they would just go off and get a job. Not even apprenticing for a job, they would just get one. They'd start working in the coal mines or working in the factories. Now this was pre-child labor laws and all these things, and I'm not saying we should revoke those and put children back in factories. Again, I'm kind of blaming factories for a lot of this anyway. The idea of putting the children in the factories became a problem. The boys would start learning about agriculture or farming, or they would start learning how to defend themselves. They'd go out and practice with rifles and things like that. The girls would learn how to do women things. They would learn to sew or to cook and all of those types of things. And as that kind of got out of just one family doing it, and it became groups of families doing it, and eventually became the community doing it, and you had these community schools, distinct from public schools, which only really come about since the 80s. The U.S. Department of Education has only been around for about 40 years, about the same age I am, and it has utterly failed. In the last 40 years, since we implemented a federal Department of Education, our education has gotten worse every single year, whereas prior to that, our education was getting better every single year with no federal oversight. That's, again, it's that progression, because some people point to that as the cause. The federal Department of Education is the cause for all of our problems. No, the federal Department of Education has came about because of these other things that go further back. But regardless, you had these community schools, and in the community schools would be sexually segregated. You would have boys go to one school if they went to school at all, girls go to another school, again, if they went to school at all. Some of them would apprentice as well to be nurses or teachers or other things. And they would go to school for that. Then they would go to universities and things beyond that. And they would not interact until some universities uh, had already ended sexual segregation, but most of them were also divided along sexual lines. You had universities for boys and universities for girls, or men and women, I should say. But then as universities kind of commingled, and then as high schools and junior highs began to commingle, and this kind of started in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, you started to see them kind of being mashed together, and a outcropping of that was things like dating culture, sexual promiscuity, because you're putting these teenagers who lack self-control in enclosed environments, essentially what amount to prisons, together for hours and hours upon a day with no direct, real oversight. You as parents are pawning your children off on the state to raise them and teach them and educate them, and then you wonder why they come back disagreeing with you about everything when you're not their primary authority anymore. You're not their primary educator in any sense of the word. And so you have these boys and girls whose bodies are telling them, we're adults, we want to have sex, we want to have children, we want to do these things, and you're cramming them in a building together. And then is it any wonder then that things like teen pregnancy and all of these things started to ramp up around the time of this desegregating along sexual lines, which predated desegregating along racial lines, interestingly enough. We desegregated sexually before we did racially. Um, but the mixing of these two different groups who have different needs, boys and girls, men and women, we learn differently, we think about things differently, we are different beings. We are different. We're not different like species or different creatures. We're just different in many ways, biologically, spiritually, all of these things. We are different from each other. There are differences, and anyone who denies that, it's denying that at all is proof of everything I'm talking about: the degradation of education. Uh, we produce people prior to the Department of Education. We were able to land people on the moon. We invented the microwave. We invented the refrigerator, the freezer. We invented radios, TV. Uh, all of these things were all invented. Every invention, even your cell phone, even your computer, which you think is more modern, has its roots of being invented by people who had no education from the Department of Education, or very little of it. And now, because of the Department of Education, we have people who can't read, who ate Tide Pods a few years ago, who don't know the difference between boys and girls. So you tell me which one was the better way of doing things, the way we did it for all of human history, or the last 150 years, 100 years, not 150, a little bit further back, 100 years or so, 40 years especially with the Department of Education. So we they began to mix boys and girls together, and this created things like dating culture, which led to divorce culture, because when you train yourself that, oh, I'm seeing this person and I kind of like them, but now I don't kind of like them anymore, so we're just going to stop seeing each other. You're training yourself to leave a relationship when it gets hard. The way that relationships used to work was not via dating. Dating, again, is an incredibly new invention that came about as a result of the Victorian era. The ideas that inform modern courting and dating all come from that. The way that people used to meet goes back to the guilds, the clans, the families. That you would be in a community, small community, big community. If it was a small enough community, then it was like we're 3 days away from the next town. There's 5 boys and 6 girls that are all around marriageable age. I like you the most. Let's get married. Because it was that or you would marry no one, because the next nearest town was days away. But that kind of anecdotal aside, the way that it would usually work is that the boys and girls would be raised separately for the most part. They might occasionally have little events or dances and community parties and block parties and things like that, holidays, harvest festivals, where they would have chances to intermingle. But ultimately, more often than not, what would happen is that a young man, probably in his late teens, early 20s, would be learning a trade. He'd be joining a guild. He'd be becoming a mason. And he would be apprenticing there, and he would be meeting the other masons. You would have a young woman whose father was a mason, and he would meet that young man. He would work with that young man for years, 2 3 years. And then one day he would say, you seem like a good man, why don't you come to my house for dinner, meet my daughter, see if y'all hit it off, see if y'all like each other. And that's how most people met. That's how most fathers found husbands for their daughters, was they knew these men, they met these men, and they would bring them to their daughter, and they would say, hey, what do you think of this guy? uh, this is not the same thing as necessarily an arranged marriage, though those exist as well in different cultures and in different contexts. But the idea of dating, of your kind of happiness or your love being the most important thing, is incredibly modern, and it's also incredibly selfish in a lot of ways. Love is an emotion. It's like hunger. It comes and it goes. It's loyalty, it's commitment. That's what the vows are all about, right? For better or worse, till death do us part. It's not as long as I'm happy, as long as I feel like I love you, because that feeling will come and go. That the person you're with, if you're with any person ever in any context, there's going to be a point where they piss you off and you don't love them in that moment. And it's up to you to be mature and say, it doesn't matter if I love you right now or not. I'm committed to this friendship or this marriage, depending on the degrees, right? That you don't just give up on another person because you're somewhat unhappy in the moment, or because you you just don't you just don't feel the same spark that you felt before. There's an interesting thing that you realize as you get older, and this is a scientific fact, that your taste buds, for example, change. Your emotions change. Things that used to bring you joy stop bringing you that same joy sometimes, in all things. If you think back to when you were a teenager, the things that you found the most exciting thing when you were 12 years old, if that same event, you could have the most exciting thing in the world happen to you when you were 12. If that same event happened to you when you're 20, when you're 40, is it going to cause the same swell of emotions? No. Does that mean that the emotions you felt then weren't real? No. Does it mean that it causes no emotions? Not necessarily. Does it mean you should never value that again? No. It could still be a great event to have occur. That it could still be a good thing to have happen. And in the same way with a marriage, you shouldn't give up just because it's hard, or just because you don't feel the same spark, or it's, oh, the spark has died. Well, sparks die because you let them, because you stop fanning the flame, because you don't continue to add kindling. So finding those things, there's the expression that once you're married doesn't mean that you stop pursuing your spouse. Just because you've got them doesn't mean that you give up the hunt, for lack of a better term. You should always be pursuing them. You should always be wanting to grow that relationship. But because of the way our dating culture works, we have trained people to just move on when they're no longer happy, when they don't feel the same fuzzy wuzzies that they felt before. And this gets even deeper into other territory that I might get into in another video. But So that's another aspect of the problems that we have, is the way that our that husbands and wives and men and women even find each other to have families, to create families, to have children. And let alone, once if you do happen to marry someone and you do happen to have children, and all the problems that come with that, as far as how do you afford it in the modern context. Well, maybe you don't afford it in the modern context. Why don't you try affording it in the historical context? Look at the way that people used to live, big families in big houses. You and your wife might struggle to afford a two-bedroom house for you and your kids, but if you and your parents and her parents, maybe even your brother and his wife, and if you all bought a plot of land, could you build a house and another house on it, and or one house with 10 rooms? Could five people's incomes allow the three of them to stay home to raise the kids? That's the way that families used to work, and that was targeted and intentionally destroyed. And again, I don't think it was necessarily for some nefarious ends, as far as we're destroying this to cause all these problems later. It was we're want to change the way that things work because we see it as an efficient means to the end that we want. And so this gets back to the idea of the way that conspiracy theories kind of work. That there's the Illuminati out there, where there's the World Economic Forum, which is I mean, it's a real thing. They really do try to plan out the world economy and all those things, but that somehow they're always pulling all the strings, or people who are like, oh, it's the Jews, or it's whatever group they want to blame. But the fact of the matter is that no, it's not. There's not some great cabal that just happens to work together that is super secretive. It's a bunch of different groups, a bunch of different factors. This is why I was saying that the communists and the feminists are kind of really in bed together now, but there was a time when the feminists were really in bed with a capitalist, because it was about the women who kind of started the first suffragettes. A lot of them were wealthy women who had gotten wealthy by marrying industrialists and capitalists, and then sometimes divorcing them multiple, sometimes having two or three husbands that were wealthy industrialists that they had divorced, and they kind of bankrolled the whole thing. And it was all via capitalism. It was all via industry. It all came from those kinds of things, and they very much partnered with that, and kind of women shouldn't have children at all, and if they do have children, we send them off to the school because we want the women in the factories, so that our factories can make more money. Now, however, they're kind of in bed with the intelligentsia and the communists and those things. So it's these different groups, and some groups are more kind of at loggerheads and almost will never really work together. But even in those groups, there'll be touch points where they're willing to compromise, where they're willing to work together. But you see that as kind of the overarching problem is, how do you combat something, one, that's been going on for 200 years, and two, that doesn't have like a direct, this is the cause and this is the ultimate foe, that if you just defeat them, you'll solve the problem. And that's really the question of wrestling with it. I, as a Christian, think that the ultimate answer has to come from the church, that we as the church have to kind of step up and say, no more, no more. We're not going to play the game the way that you have said we have to play the game. We're not going to let you appeal to our morality and our better nature and our benevolence, and then turn that benevolence against us and attempt to destroy us. That we're not going to let you manipulate us and change the game, because there's only two sides. You have God and you have the devil, right? Jesus or Satan. Those are the two sides, and you're on one or the other. Uh, that that's every conflict ultimately boils down to that. Sometimes devil fights devil, but ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, those are the only two real sides. Anything else is just kind of passing the buck. It's just a deception. It's just a lie. Um, and so I think the ultimate answer has to come from the church, and that's one of the reasons that how the church is governed is something that's been really on my mind and my heart lately. Is how do you oversee a church? Because that is, I think, the only place that the answer can ultimately come from. Is the church is the heart of the community, or it should be. And if it is, then the whole community can be healthy if the church is healthy. But our communities aren't healthy because our churches aren't healthy. And part of the reason for that it goes back even to education a little bit. The term Sunday school comes from the idea that throughout the week, the family was busy farming. The kids were helping farm in whatever ways they could, depending on their age. And then on Sunday, the whole community came together at the church. And you had Sunday school, where the kids were sent to school on Sunday. That's what Sunday school was. They learned to read, they learned to write, they learned mathematics, they learned fundamentals of basic science or history or principles that they needed to learn. And then the rest of the week, again, was spent with the family. And they would learn there as well. They would talk about their lessons, they would learn their whatever they needed to learn. And most importantly, they would learn about God. And so that was a fundamental part of education. As I was saying, the communities would come together and have community schools, and that started with Sunday schools. That the community came together at the church on Sunday because sometimes it took you half a day to get there. So you'd leave, you'd come in, you'd spend Saturday in the town center, and then the next morning you'd Sunday school, and then you'd leave. You'd Sunday church, and then you'd leave and you'd head home, and you get home in the evening. And oftentimes that was how people came into towns. That's why a lot of communities have farmers markets, and they're almost always on Saturdays. Why? Because Saturday was the day that everybody brought everything to town. You spent Saturday in town. You stayed Saturday night. Sunday you had church, Sunday school, and all of that stuff, and in a big community meal oftentimes. And then you went home, and you got home Sunday night, and that built community and that built healthy churches. And not every community necessarily works the same way. Obviously different communities have different needs, but another part of the issue is that we don't have communities, we have cities. We don't have towns anymore, or villages really. That even in towns and villages they operate like cities, and in big cities are the worst places. I mentioned earlier, for example, that out of the Victorian era and the Industrial Revolution, you had organized police forces, kind of birthed out of that. Prior to that, men enforced the laws of the community just because they were the men in the community. There's this idea. This goes back to another thing of the relationship between men and women. A lot of promiscuity from women in today's world gets excused because they say, well, this is just how men act, and now women are just acting the same. Even if I were to grant that men used to be horrible cads who slept around with a lot of women, um, the way to solve that is there's the expression of you don't if the pig is in the mud, you don't need to get in the mud with them, right? That just makes you both dirty. So if men were that way, you don't solve that problem by also getting in the mud with them. You call them out of the mud and you say, you are not pigs, you're supposed to be men, get out of the mud. But the kind of answer from the feminists was, well, we'll just get in the mud with them. But I actually take contention with the idea at all that men used to be that way. I think that, again, this was another thing that kind of birthed out of the idea of Victorian era, Industrial Revolution, all of those things. During that area and prior to it, if a man was in a town and he was a cad, if he was a man who was sleeping around with other men's wives and daughters and sisters, and he had no care for them, and he just was spilling his seed, as it were, with no care for the women that he was advantaging himself upon, the men of the town would run him out of town on a rail. They would tar him and feather him and run him out of town because the women he was taking advantage of were their wives and daughters and sisters and mothers, and they did not want them to be taken advantage of, so they would run him out of town. And this idea of the flippant of the man, the libertine man, was birthed out of cities, out of these massive cities where there was no, there were no men protecting the city because they had pawned it off on the city, on the state. But the state, the city, it's not a person. There's no emotion in it. It reminds me of a story that I heard, and it's from the 80s. There was a young woman who had escaped from a satanic cult that had been using her as a breeder, and there had other women there as well, but she's the one who managed to escape. They essentially impregnated her over and over again to have children that they then used in child sacrifices. She escaped, and the first people that she came across, she told what was happening to, and they told her, just go tell the police. They didn't really believe her anyway, but they just told her, go to the police, go to the police. And then she went to the police, and the police questioned her and didn't really believe her, but humored her for about a day or two. I forget the exact time. I think it was 2 days. And by the time the police were like, okay, take us to where this cult was, they found the building, all of the paraphernalia of a cult that had been there, that had been doing these sacrifices. They found the bodies of these sacrificed children and the evidence of where she had been held and where other women had been held who had now been taken. And they escaped. And this is a story that's always stuck with me. And I don't remember all of the specifics because I heard it years and years ago, back in the 90s, I think, was when I heard of it, when I heard about it. And it was a story from the 80s. And it's always stuck with me because I know history. And so I know that at almost any other point in history prior to the modern era, the first man who came across this young woman who heard this story would have immediately rounded up a posse, and they would have gone where she told them to go, and they would have killed all of those cultists. They just would have killed them all because they're Satanists. They're evil. They're pure evil. Go kill them. Don't. There's no second thought. That was how you defended the community. The man who was abusing women, you ran him out of town on a rail. The people, if another man made accusations against you that were untrue, you challenged him to a duel, a lawful duel that had a judge and had rules and regulations. But they did away with that. They did away with duels. They did away with the ability for fathers to pursue justice for their children. They did away with the possibility of husbands pursuing justice for their wives. And so what you ended up with is they were said, well, I have to let the state handle this. But the state can't handle it. There's not enough of them, number one. And number two, there's no mechanism for rapid response for situations that require that. And the way that it used to be done was that people handled it themselves. And when they handled it wrong, that was when the state came in. We have inverted it. So educating your children is your responsibility. The state was there in case you had the state, I say, the community, the other people around you, and ultimately the governing body was there for when you couldn't. If there was a knowledge base that you lacked, like you didn't know enough about mathematics, so you needed someone to teach maths to your children, the state would have the means to teach that via, again, the community, all those things. You would go up in level, but it always started with you. If there was a need for justice, it started with you. And if you couldn't do it on your own, then you would gather the community, you'd gather together. And if that wasn't enough, then if you would handle it. So thinking about it, if there was a group of raiders outside of your town and they were coming in and stealing your cattle, then you would fight them off if you could. If you couldn't, you would gather a group of men to help you fight them off. But then if there was, for example, the Mexican army was coming across the hill, if we're thinking about, for example, the Texians who fought for independence, again, during the Victorian era, or going back even further to the English Civil War or the Hundred Years' War, for example, between France and England. It was a war that on and off again lasted for 100 years. If you were in Normandy, you were technically subjects of England, and suddenly you saw French soldiers coming across the hill, you couldn't fight off the French army. You and your community couldn't. So you would fall back to the keep of the local lord. If there wasn't enough soldiers there, they would fall back further and await the English army to come and help them. And ultimately, it ended up taking too long for the English army to come across the English Channel. So England ended up losing ultimately the Hundred Years' War and all of their mainland holdings. But that was the mechanism. But we've entirely inverted it. Now there are places in America where if someone breaks into your house, you are legally obligated to attempt to flee before you defend your home and your family. It it blows my mind, the idea that you are required by law in some places to assume the best intentions of a person breaking into your house. It Someone breaks into your front door, you don't know if they're alone. You don't know if it's some gang initiation, and if you flee out of your back door, there's six more men back there waiting for you because they know you have to flee. That your home is ultimately supposed to be your castle, but they command you to flee in some states. And if you don't flee, you can face criminal charges for that. But again, you don't know if they're just there to steal your TV or they're there to kill you and rape, I should say, YouTube, right? It might be long enough into the video that it doesn't matter, but that they're there to advantage themselves upon your wife and children. And so if you flee, if that's their goal, they're just going to follow you. And now you're exposed in the open with nothing. And again, it's not even including the fact that they could be a part of a gang and there could be six other men out there waiting for you. But that's some states in America. That's most countries in the world. And yet we think that that's a better system because it avoids the occasional mistake. What mistake is there? But even if there is, and that's one of the arguments that you always give, well, what if you know you get a posse and they go after somebody and they get the wrong guy, and it's like then you bring them up on charges again. That's the next step. that the state is there not to do things for you, but to be there to help you do things. And if things get done wrong, then to correct for that. So if you have, for example, let's say you have a father and he believes that someone has done something untoward with his daughter. And so he goes and he enacts vengeance, and then it turns out that he was wrong. He should face charges for that. But if it turns out he's right, then he shouldn't. That's the way the law used to work. You were allowed to defend yourself and defend your family and to defend your community. And if it ended up being that it was a circumstance that was questionable, then the judge would come in and look at the evidence, and the alert lawyers would argue on your behalf and on the other side's behalf. And that's when a jury of your peers would come together and determine if you acted in right accord with justice. There's an expression that I have that maybe it'll get picked up and become a viral expression. It is the law without justice is tyranny, but justice without the law is still justice. And that was something that people used to understand. That you just because something is in the law, that doesn't make it just. And if you have law without justice, it's just tyranny. But you can have justice without the law, and it is still justice. And that doesn't mean that you go outside of the law willy nilly either. But our law used to understand that. Again, for example, with duels, that used to be a legal practice, and it was regulated. It was highly regulated, and no one could no one could force you to do it. The idea was that you were compelled to do it by honor. You're compelled by honor and dignity to stand up for yourself and to stand up for your family and your community. But ultimately, if you wanted to back down, if you, and this is one of the other things that even in those, again, they were highly regulated, that oftentimes just stepping up was enough, and they weren't all to the death. They didn't all use guns. You could have different types of duels. Ultimately, it ultimately wasn't any more dangerous inherently than a lot of the sporting events we have nowadays. It's two guys, but we did away with that because it was didn't fit with what they were trying to build, which was a world in which everything was nice and everything was polite. But it wasn't even unpolite. It was highly civilized, highly regulated, and it was just men. But because of that, that masculine sense of justice had to be done away with, because men don't like to be taken advantage of. We don't like it. We don't like to be cast aside. We don't like to be dishonored. We don't like to be forgotten and ignored. And that's what our society has done more and more and more. And it started with saying, hey, men, what you really need to be is factory workers. That's what we need from you. We need you to be. We need that to keep this society going. We need factory workers so we can build these weapons so that we can beat the French or the English or whichever side you're on. We need you in these factories so that we can feed your family and the community. And less of us will need to farm because we're going to have better farms, and less of us need to do these things because we're going to be doing that. So we need you in these factories to help us take care of things. And men stepped up because men are willing to step up. But they didn't see ultimately where that would lead. And again, even the people setting it up didn't see where it would ultimately lead. The ideas of evolution as well, with the idea that we're all just animals, and we're just animals. We're just another species. We're no different than monkeys or dogs or cattle. And then so it became a, well, if we're no different than animals, then why would we treat each other any differently than animals? What is it? The dog doesn't care about ultimately the other dogs, that it's just out for itself. And that's how people started to behave. That's how we taught people to behave. That's how we told people to behave. And that's how they behave. They behave like little cogs in a wheel, and they behave like animals. And neither one of those is how they're supposed to behave. And so I just think about those things, just think about how we got to where we are and what brought it about, and all of the little things, the way that we used to do things, the way that things used to be done, the way that things were before. And there's a lot of people who pine for the 1950s, or what was like the 19 teens, 1920s. They have all these little moments that they pine for. And one, I don't necessarily pine for any moment of history. I don't think that any moment of history was perfect. Obviously, I think that there's always been struggles, there's always been hardships, there's always been troubles. I just mentioned troubles twice there, but that's because troubles come and come again. But there's never been a perfect moment in history. So there is no like, I want to go back to something else. This is one of the reasons that while I call myself a conservative, it's hard to kind of call myself that, because what are we trying to conserve? What are we trying to conserve? And so I think maybe something like traditionalists might be a better term than conservatives, because we want to get back to tradition. Conservative gives the idea of keep things as they are, and fundamentally that tends to be what conservatives want to do. Progressives are trying to progress. Conservatives are just trying to stay and conserve. But the problem is if you just stay where you are, that's stagnation, that's death, that's the swamp. And progressives are just all about moving forward, but they're moving forward with blinders. They're not actually looking where they're going. They're just going, and they're running themselves off of a cliff. And so neither side of this political divide that we have here in America and much of Europe as well, even though they have different kind of terms and names for a lot of these things, are are right, are going in the right direction, are doing the right things. We need to be reestablishing the foundations that were destroyed. But that foundation that was destroyed wasn't the nuclear family from the 1950s. It was the real family, the clan, the community, the church. It was this, that was the foundation. A husband and a wife with their 3 kids in a white picket fence is not going to save your country. It's not going to do it. But 20 of those families all together with their parents and the grandparents and the brothers and the sisters, that can save your country, because that can actually take care of each other. That can actually look after each other. That's not just one family, one island, one family off on their own. It's a community, it's people. It's people working together, teaching each other, understanding the world around them and the way the world really is, and working together to make it better. Because we should be progressing as well, but what are we progressing towards? We're progressing towards what worked and what can work again. We're progressing towards something that is higher, that is better. We're progressing towards a city on a hill that is a light to the world. That is what we should be progressing towards. They take the term progressive and they're not progressing towards anything. They're lemmings running off a cliff. We could be actually making real progress towards a real goal that can really last. But we have to know how it got broken in the first place, and we have to know how it was before. We have to know things that people just don't know. Most people think history, most Americans, I should say, think that history can consist of like 4 events: World War II, the American Civil War, the American Revolution, a little bit, and then the things that have happened in the last 10 years. Anything beyond those, and the vast majority of Americans have no idea at all. And unfortunately, even when it comes to those events, most of them don't know much about those events at all. I might do a whole video about World War II was not a war between fascism and liberal democracy. It was a war between communism and fascism, and communism won. We were just, the liberal democracies were just caught in the middle and refused to pick a side. And then when they helped the communists finally beat the fascists, that meant the communists won because the liberal democracies didn't stop them. Might do a whole video about that, but that might also be enough right there, that people don't know that. People just don't know that. People don't know that the American Civil War was not a civil war, it was a revolutionary war. Civil wars are where you're trying to overthrow the current government and implement your own. That wasn't the South's goal. The Confederate States wanted to break away and form a new nation. They didn't want to overthrow the other nation. They were perfectly willing to let the Union do its own thing, and the Union said, no, you can't. We're one nation and we're going to stay one nation. Personally, I think the Union was right. I think they had the right of it and they ended up winning. I think that was a good thing ultimately. So I'm not a, what do they call it, a boogaloo boy. Those people were saying Civil War II, let's do it. No, I don't think we need another revolution. I don't think we need another civil war. Hopefully we can avoid it. We're currently in a lot of civil strife, but hopefully we get past it like we've done a couple of other times before throughout our history without it going to full bloody conflict. But we'll see what ends up happening with that. And the American Revolution, another one, people just don't know very much about it. You have people who think that the majority of the founding fathers didn't believe in God at all, let alone that the majority of them were Christians. Uh, a lot of people will acknowledge that they believed in God, but call them all deists or those types of things. You haven't even read any of their writings if you think that they didn't believe in God. Even the ones who, by modern standards, would be considered maybe agnostic, would have still have said that that Christianity was the founding principles of this nation, and without it, this nation cannot stand. So again, I'm starting to go into all kinds of other topics. This video is now an hour long of me kind of rambling about this, but it's just kind of my thought processes of these things and just where it kind of went wrong, what we should be working towards, where identifying the flaws and the problems and where they kind of rooted and stemmed from, and the destruction of the family. Again, not the nuclear family of the 1950s, which was actually birthed out of the destruction of the real family. So even it was not, the reason that it failed is because it doesn't work. It gave us 20, 30 years of decent, kind of growth and some stability, but then it fell apart because it's not sustainable, because it's not a real family, it's not a real community. Um, but so recognizing these problems, that feminism wasn't the cause of the problems, it was another symptom of the problems. That the problem ultimately came from the destruction of the real family, the destruction of the church as the heart of the community, where the company store became the heart of the community, the destruction of the guilds and the farming communities and those things that brought about the industrial revolution, that was caused because of the coming about of the industrial revolution and the need for factory workers and the need for cities, the implementations of public schools and all these things. Again, that's a symptom of this need for more factory workers. Public schools are designed to churn out low IQ, low information factory workers, and we need less and less factory workers. So now they churn out low information people who then can be voting blocks or these other things. But again, it's all a symptom. It's all a symptom of that. And so how do you fix that? You recognize the problem, number one, and once you see the problem was the destruction of these things, you think about, well, how do we get back to those things? And you start small scale, you and your family, you and your community. If you're struggling with bills and you have your parents, don't be so proud that you're not willing to say, hey, mom, dad, what if we pool our resources? You've got a decent sized house, or we could maybe both sell our, not necessarily even sell our houses, lease them out, but we can kind of come together, figure out a way that you can repair what was intentionally destroyed that has led us to where we are. Your church, have a true overseer who trains up other overseers, who then can plant new churches, who then can grow new communities. Educate your own children. Don't pawn them off on the state. Handle justice yourselves, not in an illegal way. We live in a society with that has come to, again, it's inverted it now, where we're required to start with the organized police force, but do it the right way. Set up community watches, maybe, those types of things. Take care of your actual family, your actual community, and because you don't need anyone else to help you do that, you can just start to do it. You can just do things. Oftentimes, uh, remind